Welcome to the Dawes Arboretum Maple Syrup Trail. My name is Beth Spielis and I'm an interpretive educator here at the Arboretum.
Hi, and I'm Nancy Gregory, and I'm an environmental educator here at the Arboretum as well.
Did you know that maple syrup is a North American crop? Take a look on the map of where it's produced. All those areas of the United States and Canada where sugar maple trees are native. The shape of the leaf might be familiar from the Canadian flag or from other ways that you've seen like that. So how is it that we make maple syrup? Basically what we're doing is we're poking a hole in the tree. So imagine if I'm a tree here and this black jacket is the bark. We need to go in an inch or two in there to get into the tubes of the tree where we're going to collect the sap. Is there a special recipe that we use from sap to make syrup? No, we don't need to add cinnamon or any particular flavors. All the great sweet goodness is already in there. What we've got to do is we've got to drive off the water. You might wonder too, can we use trees other than sugar maples? Yeah, certainly. You can make butternut syrup, different types of hickory or different types of maple syrup. But there's a special reason why we choose the sugar maple tree. That one seems to have the most sugar content. It still takes 40 or 50 gallons of sap, which looks and tastes a lot like water, to get 1 gallon of syrup. We'll show you later on how we do that at our evaporator. Basically, we've got to drive off all of the water to get to that sweet goodness. But 40 or 50 gallons to make 1 gallon of syrup, or another way to put it, 2 or 2.5% of that sap is the sweet syrup. So it all starts with sap. When we're gathering that sap and getting the sweetness from the trees, we're actually gathering what was produced last growing season in the green leaves, which are absent now in the wintertime. What was happening, water was coming in through the roots of the trees, carbon dioxide was coming in through the air, that same gas that we breathe out and that our cars produce as well. That was going into the tree, and the green pigment where it's able to produce oxygen, water, and sugar, its own food. So if you think about it, trees don't capture and eat squirrels, do they? And they don't rip it open a bag of potato chips. That would be silly. Like all green plants, they're able to produce their own food. It's called photosynthesis, something made from light. When we're tapping into the tree, we're getting into the plumbing of the tree where this sap is flowing. And we do it this time of year because generally it's sunny and above freezing during the day, and it's colder at night. That swing in temperature increases pressure in the tree and allows us to capture the sap. Let's imagine that we take a trip back in time, making maple syrup here in this part of what is now Licking County. We might talk about the sugar moon, a full moon at this time of year. We might talk about tomahawks, stone axes, the Delaware, the Wyandot, Shawnee. All types of Native Americans that we knew were in the area and were doing different things to produce maple syrup. They would have used a tomahawk like this to get that hole into the tree and directed the sap into maybe a birch bucket, something like that. What about the mound builders in the area? Being prehistoric, we don't have records, we don't necessarily know what they might have done, if they participated in this or not. But we knew these tribes that I mentioned, Wyandot, Delaware, Shawnee, were definitely in the area that would gather at this time of year and make this product. And they had a word they used for it, an Algonquin term for making syrup. And I'm going to give you a riddle and see if you can figure out what the word is. All right. There are 3 parts to the riddle. The first part is another name for the Queen City of Ohio. The second part is what you call a deer that has antlers. And the third part is another resource that we get from trees besides sap. What do you think? How about that antlered deer? Not a doe, but you're right, a buck. How about another resource from trees? Not thinking paper. I'm not thinking nuts. Wood, yes, let's talk about wood. Buck and wood. How about the Queen City of Ohio? Not Columbus, not Cleveland. I almost gave it away. Cincinnati or Cincy. So we put those 3 together, Cincy buck wood. It means drawn from the wood. Let's take a look at how they might have made it. So making Cincy buckwood. The Native Americans gathered that sap in a birch bark bucket, but they couldn't put that over the fire, could they? Or this log. They filled this with sap. Could they put that on the fire? It's likely to crack or even burn, and they would lose all of their sap. So what do we think they did? They might have used stone boiling. These stones could be heated over a campfire. They wouldn't burn. Then they could use a tool, maybe deer antlers, to drop them into the sap. Out would sizzle a lot of the steam in the water, and they could transfer that back and forth and keep trying to get it hot again and to get the steam to escape. Now, in modern times, folk anthropologists have tried this with not much success. As they transfer it back and forth, the ash makes the product more like soap than like something edible. But we don't know all of the secrets or all the methods they may have used to try to get the heat from the rocks into that sap. And what did Native Americans use syrup for? Well, they might add it to a hot or to a cold drink. They might put it on cereals. One of the most common ways, use it with a bitter medicine, and definitely with their meat. They would hunt deer in the area, venison, cook that meat. They also hunted bear in the area. You have to go a little further east these days to find black bear. They would take the bear fat, mix it with syrup, add their cooked venison. Tastes good. Some of you might say you like it and some not so much, but really it's not much different than chicken nuggets with honey dipping sauce or sesame chicken from the Chinese place. Sounds pretty good.
Okay, so we've taken our trip back in time and we know a little bit about the Native Americans and their syruping methods. But now we're all the way up to pioneer times here in the Ohio Territory. So by this point, the pioneers were gathering the sap as well, that they maybe learned from the Native Americans that lived in the area. But they were not so kind to the trees. Think about it. When the Native Americans cut that little notch in the tree, did they harm the trees? Well, yeah, they probably did a little bit, but the trees recovered and did fine from year to year. But the pioneers were not so kind. They would gouge out a huge part of the tree, put their bucket to collect the sap inside that hole in the tree. They got pretty good sap, but every year they had to go further and further into their sugar bush to collect sap. A lot of those trees died. Now, some people might think that's kind of wasteful, right? Well, yes and no. At some point they had to build those log cabins, and they would fell trees for that. Or they used the wood to heat their homes or to cook over the fire. But after a while they realized that was maybe too many trees dying. So they ended up doing it with a spile. A spile is just, for in their days, it was just a piece of wood that was hollowed out, and it directed the sap from the little hole that they made in the tree. They collected it, and then they would take their sap and cook it on a huge metal kettle outside. Now, who do you think did most of that cooking? Some people might say Mom, but they'd be wrong. Some people might say Dad. They'd be wrong. It actually was the children. Dad had lots of other work to do. Mom was super busy, so the kids were the ones who had to keep stirring that pot. Nobody wants burnt sugar, so they kept stirring and stirring the sap that was heated under the fire, under the kettle, by a fire. And the boys, they were chopping wood and bringing it to keep that fire at just the right temperature. So when it started to get rather hard to stir, then it was time to bring in Mom. After a while, she'd stir it and she would say, "It's a waxin'." Well, that told them that it was time to run and get their bowls of snow. And they'd pour it on the snow, be able to pick it up, and it was like taffy. It was delicious. But Mom wanted it to go past syrup and into maple sugar. And maple sugar is just maple sap that is cooked a little bit more than maple syrup. We want to drive off more of that water. So she would keep on stirring, and eventually she would say, "It's a sugarin'." Well, when she yelled that, the kids came running again, but this time with containers, think about like your loaf pan or something like that, but probably made out of wood back in those days. They'd fill it with the maple sap that would harden like a block of sugar. Kind of like our brown sugar today. When it gets really dried out, it's pretty hard. It was just like that. It was precious back in those days. Remember, there was no Kroger nearby. So out here in the wilderness of Ohio, sugar was very important and very precious. They might break off a little piece to give to the children as a Christmas present. They would shave off some to put in cakes or pies. Or if they had excess, they could trade it with the traders that came through the area and get things that they couldn't get out here, like maybe sewing needles or special fabric or precious stuff like that. Okay, so we might be wondering, how did the Native Americans and the pioneers even know that that delicious sap was in those sugar maple trees? Well, we think they probably learned it from nature. This tree is a poplar tree, which is super popular with yellow-bellied sapsuckers. A yellow-bellied sapsucker is a kind of woodpecker that flies around the forest, tapping into trees. He rat-tat-tats with his tough beak and makes rows of holes in a tree. Sap holes, sap wells we call them. He comes back, checks them out, and will lap up some of that sap, but also love the insects that got stuck inside those sap wells. And we think that's probably how they learned about that wonderful maple sap. So does tapping damage the trees nowadays in modern times? Well, yeah, it does. It does do a hole in the skin of the tree, into the bark, through the bark actually, and into the plumbing of the tree, into those flowing xylem and phloem tubes that are inside the bark of the tree. So yes, there's a hole, and yes, it's damaged. But we're not killing trees anymore. We would never do that at the Dawes Arboretum. No, we have a method to drill a hole with a drill that makes a small hole, and we use taps that are now metal taps or plastic taps that are very small. We gather what we need, and then we stop tapping trees in about 2 weeks or so. Once the tree starts waking up a little bit, we know that that sap, those sugars, are necessary for the tree. So we stop our tapping. We can take a look at this tree cookie from years ago. Lots of dates on this tree cookie. It tells us that this tree was a very young tree in 1918. But you can also see some of the tap holes where the tree was tapped, and then it compartmentalized that hole and kept on growing for many more years. Here's another one over here. And picture that through the whole height of the tree. Those parts of the plumbing of those tubes are closed off. But this tree was healthy enough and kept on growing. So we usually tap a tree when it is about 30 years old. It takes about that long for sugar maple to grow to about 12 inches in diameter, about like a dinner plate size. Before that, it's too young, and we don't want to hurt the tree. Trees that are large, like this one, could have had 2, 3, 4 even taps at a time. That's not done so much anymore. Now mostly 1 or 2 taps is enough for maple syrupers, producers, to gather the sap. You might notice that these tap holes were all on this side of the tree. We have a sign here that says this is the north side, there's the south. We basically tap more on the south side of the tree. Now, is the sap any different from the north side to the south side? Not at all. We tap on that side because it warms up a little bit more during the day. right? Think about how the sun goes around our forest. So we know that this flow is a little bit stronger and we can gather our sap more quickly. Let's go on and see how the Dawes family gathered their sap.
So the Dawes family moved to this area around 1917, more than 100 years ago. And they were already planting sugar maple trees and tapping the sugar maple trees that were on the property. They would make their syrup, put it in a jug, an earthenware jug, and save it and use it as gifts for friends and family. Maybe they'd even add a sack of buckwheat flour as part of that gift. They built this log cabin in the 1920s. It's kind of a summer retreat. If you've ever been to the Daweswood House Museum, the home they had on this property, it's up on a hill in the bright, warm sunshine. In the summertime, this would be a nice, cool retreat, a place where they could hang out with family and friends. The small building here is a spring house that went along with the cabin. A spring house is kind of like one of our modern day appliances. Do you know which one? It's like a refrigerator. There's spring water that bubbles up from the earth. Similar to a cave, it's always kind of cold, maybe 55, 60 degrees. So that cold water is coming up even in the summertime, and it's able to keep food cold within that spring house. So the Dawes family's sugar house was near their home on that hill. But we've been making a tradition of making maple syrup here and continued that over the decades. In the 1990s, this cabin was converted to what we would call a sugar house by that roof that you can see that's popped up next to the chimney, but there in the center, that's all open ventilation. So as the evaporator in the cabin boils that sap and thickens it into syrup, the steam is allowed to escape. We wouldn't be able to have it all indoors because everything would just be soaking wet. Any curtains, any clothes, anything would be soaking wet. So this way the steam escapes. So in this way we're able to continue on that tradition, treating all of our sweet tooths just as the Dawes family did way back when.
If you have sugar maples at home, you might want to make your own syrup this winter. You would need a couple tools. You might like a collection container like this jug, or you could use something like we use, these blue buckets. But you definitely want to use something to tap into the tree. You definitely want to use a good spile. These are the blue spiles that we use here at the Dawes Arboretum. Your jug or our blue buckets would hang down here and the sap would drip out into your container. Here are some holes from past years. This tree has compartmentalized that wound and healed over, which means we can't tap that same spot again. We have to keep moving over about a hand's width. We use the blue spiles and the blue buckets because we have learned that UV light can pass through the blue and help kill off some of the bad bacteria that would be in the collected sap. This doesn't mean we don't still have to boil it down and filter it several times to get it nice and delicious. But the blue does help a little bit.
We hope you enjoyed this tour, the Dawes Arboretum maple syruping from past to present.
We also hope that you'll come back and visit us at the Arboretum sometime soon. Thanks for joining us.